since we are in New York, it only seems right that we start by kicking off the conference with an industry update. Our industry update will come from Amanda Reiman, who is the Vice President of Public Policy and Research for New Frontier Data. New Frontier is a premier data analytics and technology firm specializing in the global cannabis industry, delivering solutions that enable the cannabis industry and its consumers actionable data to move forward. Founded in 2014, New Frontier's data's research and analysis have been utilized in more than 100 countries.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It is so wonderful to see everyone. I'm Dr. Amanda Reiman, and I am currently the Vice President of Public Policy Research for New Frontier Data. I know it's loud out there, so I'm going to use my cheerleading voice so that people in the back can hear. But there's plenty of room up closer if folks are having trouble hearing. So it is such a pleasure for me to be addressing you all today. You know, I've been working in cannabis for over 20 years, which in cannabis years is like 500 years, and I've seen things change. When we first started this journey in cannabis legalization, we were trying to convince people that cannabis consumers were normal people. We were trying to convince people that legalization was not going to lead to widespread use among teenagers. And interestingly, even though we've advanced a lot in cannabis legalization, we're still having to make those same arguments today. So as a scientist, which is my background, my belief is that data is the best weapon against propaganda. So that is what I'm giving you today. I'm going to give you some tools and some weapons to not only grow your business, but to continue to battle against this idea that cannabis legalization is a negative impact for society. So a little bit about New Frontier Data. Gretchen gave you the lowdown. You know, I'll say that I am extremely excited to be working for New Frontier because data in the cannabis industry, especially around consumers, is extremely hard to come by. So in 2005, I did my doctoral dissertation on medical cannabis dispensaries in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I interviewed patients from inside the dispensary, one of the first studies to do that. My sample was 130 patients. And at the time, it was the largest sample of medical marijuana patients in existence, 130. Now, 2 years later, in 2008, I wrote a grant application to the National Institute of Health, begging them to develop and pilot a national cannabis survey so that we could better understand the behaviors of cannabis consumers prior to legalization. They rejected it and called me a legalizer, and that was that. So the ability to come to New Frontier, an agency that really believes in data but also has access to unbelievable amounts of data, well, it's been a researcher's dream come true. All right. So let's talk about cannabis. Now, they gave me 40 minutes to give you an overview about everything that's happening in the cannabis industry in the US and abroad. So needless to say, this is going to be a 50,000-foot view. However, I am available and around, and I'll be sitting, so you can't, I can't run away. So feel free to find me the rest of the conference if you want insights or information a little bit deeper into what I'm presenting today. So I think I don't have to tell you that cannabis is spreading across the globe. So in jurisdictions, in almost every continent, we see access, some kind of access to cannabis. We see Asia kind of lagging behind, but Thailand is about to give out 1 million CBD plants to their citizens to grow. So we're absolutely seeing movement in that area as well. But as we also know, prohibition does not stop consumption, people. So when we look at the number of cannabis consumers in various regions, it is highly reflective of the number of people that live in those regions, whether or not cannabis is legalized. So the idea that prohibition somehow stifles use just hasn't come to bear. And I've got another slide that's going to knock your socks off about that topic. When we look at price, overall, globally, the price is about $9 a gram. This is highest in the Oceania region at $15. North America is $10. But just like any other commodity, price is going to be a reflection of access. So how easy is it to get? What are the taxes and other fees associated with access? And how stigmatized is the activity of obtaining and using cannabis? But there is a massive global opportunity. So when we take a look at this, oh wait, I've got this. So Asia represents 45% of the money spent on cannabis across the globe, and they're not even legal yet. So thinking about what global legalization is going to do to this market once these numbers are coming into a regulated system versus an illicit system. All right, that's the globe. Like I said, it's a 10,000-foot view, but happy to talk any more with you afterwards, because I think what you guys are probably most interested in is the U.S. market. So let's take a deeper dive into several aspects of the U.S. cannabis market, arguably the country with the most complicated relationship with cannabis on the planet. So currently, 248 million people in the United States live in a jurisdiction where they have some form of legalized access to high THC cannabis. Now, unsurprisingly, we saw and still see adult use proliferating at the coasts, the West Coast, the East Coast, with Middle America clinging to medical cannabis, but we're starting to see shifts in that as well. And there's good reason for that, because as I will show you, even though the medical cannabis markets can be quite lucrative, they are nothing compared to the revenue generated by an adult use market, and they do not put a dent in the illicit market the way that adult use regulation does. Okay, so let's take a look at future opportunity. Now, this right here is what will happen if no new jurisdictions come online. So let's say we just plateau when it comes to passing new legislation around medical or adult use states. And this is kind of happening. I mean, we have to admit, the West Coast, the East Coast, they're kind of the low-hanging fruit. We also know that not every state can pass laws via the voter initiative process, which means in some states, the only way these laws are going to change is through the legislature. So it's expected that we're going to see a slowing down of these laws changing once the states that were already progressive, already somewhat in favor of cannabis, are already there. And what we're left with are Indiana, I'm from Indiana, so I could say that, and other places that are still very much into prohibition. So this is what happens if nothing new happens, right? So by 2030, we're looking at about a $58 billion market, with $41 billion of that being adult use. So again, remember I said that medical is great, but it doesn't really put a dent in the market? Well, you can see that in this slide when you look at the makeup of medical and overall revenue versus adult use. Now, there are some potential new markets that are definitely worth looking at. So in medical, we've got Texas. Texas, considering medical cannabis, several cities in Texas have decriminalized cannabis, including Austin. I read this morning that San Marcos, Texas, just turned in enough signatures to get decrim on their ballot. So we're starting to see it piecemeal. But Texas's medical market would add immediately about $3.2 million to this revenue. But again, as I'll show you, it's nothing compared to what an adult use market can do. When looking at adult use, the addition of Florida, Pennsylvania, and Ohio will add over $6 million, almost $7, a little over $7 million to the adult use revenue pretty much immediately. So these are potential new markets that could influence this. But, and it's a big but, the illicit market still thrives. It absolutely still thrives. So Texas has a $6 billion annual illicit market. So even if they pass medical and they're able to move about 3 million of that into the medical market, we're still talking about a $5 billion illicit market. So again, medical can definitely help you get there, but you're not really going to take over an illicit market without adult use. Even Indiana, which I'll pick on again, has a $1.8 billion illicit market. Now, you would think that regulators in these states would find it beneficial to move these folks into a regulated marketplace. But again, the propaganda, the reefer madness, the idea of what legalization is still a moral talking point amongst politicians. And as long as it continues to be so, it's going to be very hard to see meaningful movement in some of these more conservative areas. All right, let's take a minute to talk about mergers and acquisitions, because that's why you're all here. I feel like after this slide, everyone's going to get up and walk away. So the MSO battle continues. We did see some mergers and acquisitions in 2021 with Air Wellness leading the way in terms of mergers and acquisitions. However, overall, the stock outlook for cannabis companies hasn't been great. So over the past year, we saw a 30% drop in price of cannabis stocks. And the thing is that the market is still new, and the investors are not necessarily experienced, and they're not institutional, which means they're a lot more fickle. They respond a lot more quickly to the media about whether there's going to be federal legalization or there isn't going to be federal legalization. They don't really understand the long-term need to hold cannabis stocks in order to see a value and a benefit. So unless and until the federal government gives us some more stability through banking, interstate commerce, federal legalization, the stock outlook will remain unstable and volatile because nobody knows when things are going to change. We hear an article that some politician is introducing something at the federal level and everyone gets excited and buys a bunch of cannabis stock. And then a week later, they walk it back and they say, no, we're just kidding. We're going to wait a little bit longer. And then the stocks go down. So they're so highly susceptible to what is happening in the public sphere rather than what the real business opportunities may be. Okay. So let's move on to probably my favorite part, because I love to study consumers. And as I mentioned, you know, prior to legalization, we still have the National Survey, Household Survey on Drug Use. And this was how we knew everything about people that consumed cannabis. And you know what it asks? It asks if you consume cannabis, if you've consumed in the last year, and if you've consumed in the last 6 months, and how many joints you consume a day. This was the information we had going into legalization about who cannabis consumers were. And because we're asking people about a highly stigmatized behavior, it can be really difficult to get an honest assessment of what cannabis consumption actually looks like. So one of the things that New Frontier does is we do our cannabis consumer survey. And this is a nationally representative sample, meaning we're matching the numbers to the US Census population. And we survey over 4,000 cannabis consumers and over 2,000 non-consumers. And we ask them everything, from cannabis consumption habits to hobbies to what's most important when they walk into a dispensary. We even ask them what kind of music they like to listen to, all in an effort to better understand how cannabis consumers fit into the greater sphere of lifestyle. So let me tell you a little bit about what we found. So when we look, and this is not our data, by the way, this is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration data. So when we look at consumption over the past 18 years, it has increased. It has increased. Well, that's pretty expected, right? I mean, legalization is happening in places, so more people have access. And as I mentioned before, when you're asking someone whether or not they are doing an illegal behavior, depending on who they are, they're probably going to say no. Now, the really interesting exception to that is teenagers. Teenagers love to claim they're doing bad things even when they're not doing them, but adults do not play that. So when you're asking somebody, do you use cannabis, and you live in an illegal state, depending on who you are, there's a pretty good reason to say no. And I think we've captured that in the changes in past month use rate by age group. So looking at the differences between 2017 and 2020, we see that use has increased amongst every age group except the 18 to 20-year-olds. So wouldn't you know it, those developing brains are choosing not to use cannabis as much as they have in the past. Very interesting. But what's even more interesting to me is who's using it more. So when we look at the two age groups that have increased the most in their cannabis use, we are talking about those that are 35 to 39, increasing by 51%, and ages 60 to 64, increasing by 56%, and then 65 plus, increasing by 54%. So why might this be? I feel like I should take suggestions and like yell it out. No, just kidding. Well, one reason for the 35 to 39-year-olds, they're parents. Y'all, they're parents. And admitting legal drug use when you are the parent of a minor child is a huge risk, especially for women who are more likely to be the primary caregiver. So legalization gives parents the legitimacy, even though it may still be stigmatized, to at least not worry about law enforcement in admitting their cannabis use. Plus, being a parent is very stressful, especially during a pandemic. New Frontier has a report coming out pretty soon specifically on millennial consumers. So I encourage you to check that out. We found some really interesting things when looking at folks who have young children at home in terms of their cannabis consumption habits. Now, how about the older folks? Why is their percentage going up? Well, I think that this has a lot to do with stigma. And it has a lot to do with what it means to be a cannabis consumer when you grew up during Prohibition. Now, some of you young folks out there, you Zoomers, you may not really remember a time without medical cannabis somewhere. But for those of us Gen X and older, we absolutely remember when it was a huge risk to come out of the green closet. So for older adults, that pervades. And so even though they're getting older, they're using cannabis for more medical purposes, it's also the ability to come out and say, I am a cannabis consumer, and having friends that are also cannabis consumers so that you can use socially. All right, let's talk a little bit about consumer demographics, although I don't think there's any big surprises here. Oh, this is small. All right, so 62% of consumers are white. We've seen that really all along. Women are definitely catching up. So again, I think the ability for women to admit cannabis use when they're the primary caregiver of a minor child absolutely influences this. And I also think that the new products on the market, the low-dose beverages, some of the manufactured products, the low-dose edibles, may appeal more to women than men. Let's see, we've got about 46% make under $50,000 a year. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about tax rates, right, in different localities and dispensary prices. And 14% identify as LGBTQ+. Happy Pride. And I think that's all I want from this slide. Oh, 60% of current consumers are under the age of 45. So again, we're seeing increases in use among older folks, but the most intense regular consumption is still happening in those around 21 to 35 years old. Now, this is really fascinating because one of the things we've seen in cannabis research past is that people are forced to either identify as a recreational consumer or a medical consumer, right? It's mutually exclusive. Are you medical or are you not? But what we've had a feeling about for a very long time is that most people are both, right? So most people use cannabis sometimes for more of a fun recreational purpose, and then they may use it later on that day to help them sleep. And then they may use it the next day because they're going to a concert and they want the music to sound good. And then they may use a salve when they get home because their knee is sore from standing at a concert all day. So what we did with this survey is we allowed consumers to choose only recreational or only medical, but we also gave them the choice of being primarily recreational or primarily medical. And as you can see, 55% of consumers are both. And we have about the same number who are primarily recreational and who are primarily medical. So I think that this is really interesting when we think about how we market our businesses, when we think about who is our target audience. And from a policy perspective, it calls into question the arbitrary nature of finite lists of conditions for which people can obtain a medical card. Because it's not that simple. That, oh, if I have this condition, cannabis is useful to me, and if I don't, it's not. It's useful to everyone. And while I understand the need to develop a finite list of conditions because of fear that someone's going to get cannabis and use it just for fun, I think we have to kind of get with the times and understand that cannabis consumption is very personal, and it's got multiple goals. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, other really cool slide. So one of the biggest claims by prohibitionists is that prohibition reduces cannabis use, right? That if you live somewhere where cannabis is illegal, you do not use cannabis as much as someone who lives in a state where it is legal. This slide tells you that's BS, because when you look at use frequency in adult use, medical, and illicit markets, it looks pretty similar, does it? In fact, multiple times a day is 36%, 37%, and 35%. No difference based on market type. So when you are working to change laws, when you are working on reform, and someone says, but if we legalize, people are going to use it so much more, please refer to this, please. Because I think it's really important that we show people that there are enough legal jurisdictions now in the country where state lines are meaningless. And people are driving from Texas to Oklahoma, and people are driving from Idaho to pretty much anywhere else to get their cannabis. So having illegal cannabis in your state does nothing except rob you of tax revenue, because it absolutely does not stop people from using cannabis at the same rates as people in legal markets. Another thing that's interesting, as I mentioned, that arbitrary list of conditions that exists in some states, is that medical and recreational folks don't really use cannabis that differently either. We do see some differences in preferred product form. States that are only medical patients may prefer non-smoked methods of consumption. But overall, we're seeing the same use rates among medical and recreational consumers, which again calls into question this line between them, and does it really exist? And if it doesn't really exist, how do we market? And what kind of products are we talking about? And who is our consumer? And what is the messaging? Because for so long, messaging has either been, this is to help you with the healthcare, or this is to have fun. And I think consumers are finally saying both of those apply to me. So your marketing better apply to both as well. And this also comes out when we look at top motivations for use. So if you look at the leading reasons for cannabis use, relaxation is number one. Number one, 66% of people are saying, this is why I'm using cannabis. I need to relax. But if we look at the next 3 to 4 reasons, now they sound pretty medical, or at least pretty therapeutic, right? Stress relief, reducing anxiety, improving sleep quality, pain management. So the top reason, you might say, is more recreational, although you can definitely argue that relaxation reduces stress, which reduces the likelihood of disease. But I think most people would think of relaxation as more of a social recreational reason, but these others are not. So again, the top reasons why people are using cannabis are not either recreational or medical. They're both. They're all. And when you look at the most common condition managed by medical users, it's pain by a lot. And pain is a very nebulous concept, right? So there's physical pain, there's emotional pain, there's psychic pain, there's psychological pain, and they don't all present as one thing. Psychological pain presents as physical. Spiritual pain presents as psychological. So when we say pain, my guess is that we're talking about all of that, which is a very common thing for people to have in society today. So it's very fitting that it's being reflected in the data. All right, let's talk a little bit about what people are using. So flower is still queen. Flower is still queen. People still want flower. They still want to smoke them up. Joints are the most preferred form. It's still that way. It is changing, but it's still that way. So 83% of consumers say that flower is their top form, that flower is for them. It's also the most frequently used form. Edibles, vapes, concentrates, topicals, tinctures, beverages, they all have a place in the market, especially in a medical-only market, where I mentioned that people are more likely to look for non-inhaled methods of consumption, and they're definitely gaining traction. Part of the reason, as you all know, is discretion. It's a lot easier to drink a beverage on the plane, for example, than it is to try to vape in the bathroom, which you should not do. And it's also the doses are different. So, you know, when you're smoking, even if you have like a 15% THC or 20% THC, the dosing in effect may not be as specific as having a drink with 5 milligrams of THC in it or an edible with 2 milligrams of THC in it. So I think especially for newer consumers, the specificity that they get with manufactured products is a benefit, and you'll see that come out in a few minutes when I talk about non-consumers. All right, let's talk a little bit about who consumers are. So who are they as a group, right? Well, first of all, they're adventurous. They like to try new things. So 51% of consumers said that they get very excited to try new things that are available at the dispensary. You know, men were a little bit more into this. Younger people were a little bit more into this. Illicit market people were a little bit more into this. So if you've got a guy, and your guy usually has the same 5 things, and then one day he's got a 6th thing, that's pretty exciting. When you go to a dispensary and there's 20 different things, and you only really can try a few things at a time, and a new thing comes in, I mean, it's pretty cool, but it's not quite as exciting. So consumers like that. They like the new, they like things that are different, they like products they haven't seen before. But they're also frugal. You know, as I mentioned, about half of these consumers are making less than $50,000 a year. These are young folks. They're on a budget. And most of them are using multiple times a day and purchasing multiple times per week. So, you know, you do the math. Taxes are a lot. Cannabis is expensive. I grow my own. It's a lot cheaper. Highly recommend it. But keeping this in mind, I mean, there are those consumers that are like, I don't care if that eighth is $100. So-and-so is the celebrity endorser, and I want to buy it. But that's not most people. Most people are looking to get their needs met for the lowest price possible. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about what their needs are, and it kind of throws a little bit of a wrench into this whole safety, responsibility, consumption that we talk about. Consumers engage in effect pairing. So what does this mean? Well, this means that I may want a different product if I'm going to go to a loud concert outdoors than maybe a small intimate dinner party. I may want a different product if I'm with my younger brother hanging out than when I'm with my parents. So consumers are choosing products based on how they want to feel in the environment they're in, otherwise known as set and setting. You probably have all heard that before. So to engage in different activities, to create different moods, different times of day, people are choosing different products for this purpose. Now, the womp moment of this whole thing is that 51% still say the most useful information is the effect the product will have. Well, I'm here to tell you, we don't know that. I mean, we can tell you that a 20% THC product will probably have a different effect than a 5% THC product. But the reality is the terpenes, the flavonoids, the other cannabinoids, the method of ingestion, how stressed you are, what you've eaten that day, what's going on with your endocannabinoid system, what your metabolism is like, whether or not you got in a fight with your friend earlier, all of these things are going to impact the effect of your cannabis product. So I don't think we're going to get to a point where we're like, this is going to make you feel like this. But I do think we can educate consumers about what are those variables that impact effect. Educate them about terpene profiles and how those can impact effect. Educate them about method of consumption and the difference between inhalation and oral ingestion. Talk to them about set and setting. Let them know they have an endocannabinoid system. The best thing we can do is arm patients and consumers with the information they need to make a good choice. Because us saying in a blanket way, this is going to make you feel like this, is not effective. And it's never going to be, unfortunately, no matter how much we want to get to that point. And consumers are still focused on potency because right now that's the biggest indicator of what the effect's going to be. So because they can't be told this is going to make you relaxed or this is going to make you energized, we all know that indica, sativa, and hybrid are just not real. They want to know about potency. So 70% of consumers say potency levels are extremely or very important when they are making their purchase decisions. So again, education. Folks don't understand that a 15% THC product with the right terpene profile is going to lay you out way harder than a 20% THC product with a different terpene profile. They need to understand this. This is important. Consumers are choosing their product just based on THC, and we know that that's not the best way for them to find what's right for them. So a quick word about non-consumers, because they're interesting too, right? These are the consumers of the future. So 39% of them said they would try cannabis if their doctor recommended it, and 37% said they would try it if they became ill with a condition that might be helped with cannabis. So non-consumers still heavily steeped in the narrative that medical consumption is legitimate. They may not think adult use is legitimate, but they do think medical consumption, if there is a need, is legitimate. Now, something else very interesting about this. We talked about flower being queen amongst consumers. Not the case among non-consumers. So we're asking non-consumers, okay, what product forms appeal to you if you were going to try it? Edibles, number 1, followed by topicals and beverages. Flower, only 16%. So thinking about your marketing strategy, who your target audience is, are they consumers or are they non-consumers? And what is the different messaging that you'd want to release to these different populations? Okay, so really quickly, the last few minutes, I would be remiss if I didn't give you some New York specific data since we are here in New York. So if no other states in the region do anything with cannabis between now and 2030, New York will have about half of the revenue in the region at $6 billion. That's the size of Texas's illicit market. As you know, New York has a huge tourism opportunity with consumers. In 2019, which was kind of the last normal year for travel and tourism, we saw 260 million visitors to New York. So thinking about what are the needs of tourists versus the needs of residents. If you have a lot of tourists coming to your dispensary, where are they going to consume? How are they going to know what to do? What else do they want to do while they're in town? Maybe they're looking for a restaurant. So there's all kinds of opportunities to weave tourism into your cannabis offerings that will engage those tourists and differentiate you from other dispensaries. All right, so I'm just going to fly through this because I'm sure that you all already know this. Adult use in New York, there'll be 11 license types. As of May 23rd, there are 146 cultivator licenses issued. Currently, there are 10 retail licensees. Each can have 4 locations. They must be vertically integrated. There's no cap on additional retail licenses, but those will first go to equity applicants. Go New York. Current licensees can have an additional 4, but only 3 of their total 8 can be adult use. New licensees can only have 3 total and cannot be vertically integrated at all. I cannot wait to come back and study you folks in a few years and see how that all works out for you. We do know that folks that are current hemp producers in New York got first bite of the cultivation apple. If you had been cultivating hemp or high CBD cannabis for the past 2 of 4 years, you could do early activation to start growing adult use in the state of New York, but you cannot have financial interest in any other cannabis license type, which is pretty interesting. Okay, and then what you all want to see, we did a little data analysis of the most visited dispensaries in New York and the ones where people spend the most time so far in 2022. And I gotta say, Rise Manhattan and MedMen Fifth Avenue are neck and neck. So if you like one over the other, go visit it, a whole bunch, and they'll be first. So only 10 visits was between them, and this was a few months ago, so it actually may have flipped, with Columbia Care Brooklyn coming in third for most visits, and then the same 3 are at the top for where most time is spent, but MedMen Fifth Avenue takes that over, followed by Columbia Care Brooklyn, followed by Rise Manhattan. So this is the fun things we get to do at New Frontier. Okay, and then one last point about New York, because I know I'm running out of time, sourcing differences. So this is important because we saw this in California. So in California, we had unregulated dispensaries for 20 years, thousands of them. People went to them. They got cannabis. They were happy. They went home. Everything was fine. Then we introduced regulated licensed stores with huge taxes and products that didn't look that different. And guess what? No one's using them. No one's using them. So what I found is that the more entrenched your prohibition sourcing is, the more it's a part of your subculture, the harder it is to get people to change what they're doing, especially if it's working pretty well for them. So let's look at New York sourcing. So all across the country, we see 18% of consumers getting their products from private dealers. That's 24% in New York. 34% across the country go to a brick and mortar. That's 23% in New York. So, moral of the story, if y'all want people to use regulated dispensaries, you gotta have a plan. Because if someone has a guy that's coming to their apartment with all kinds of things you could get in the dispensary for a cheaper price, guess what? They're gonna keep doing that. They're gonna keep doing that. All right, so last, key takeaways. There's a lot, huh? All right. So the global cannabis market is going to expand greatly. There's lots of implications here for import-export among those with national programs. We do not have a national program in the United States. Canada is importing and exporting. South American countries are importing and exporting. We're left out of that equation right now. That's important. Proposed policy changes in the U.S. could greatly impact the size of the illicit market and bring 96% of the country's population into a legal market, but adult use laws are really the ways to make a dent in the illicit market. That's how you're gonna do it. It's not gonna be with medical. Cannabis consumption in the US has increased in both frequency and intensity. State markets are not drivers of consumption patterns, so illicit market people consume just as often as adult use market people. When an accessible and efficient sourcing subculture already exists, it might be difficult to transition people into the legal market. We like things that we know, right? We like things that we can count on. Most consumers use cannabis for both medical and recreational purposes, and desired effect, including potency, is most salient in consumers' minds. So we have some great reports out right now from New Frontier Data. We have our Cannabis Consumer Report, which dives way deeper into the data I gave you today. We have our ESG report, which we recently presented at Regenibus at the UN, and then our Cannabis Trends report. As I mentioned, we've got a report coming out on millennial consumers. Super interesting and really driving a lot of the market right now. So please have a look out for that.
If anybody has any question, I'll raise your hand and I'll come to you.
Hi, Amanda. I just have a question about how the terpene profiles survive or whether the terpene profiles survive the extraction process and what the producers do in response to that.
So the question was whether terpene profiles survive the extraction process, and the answer is it depends on the extraction process. So when we look at more, I would say, old school methods of extraction, which I enjoy, like agitation and temperature extraction of whole plant, the terpenes are pretty much intact. When we're talking about butane extraction or other types of chemical extraction, many times the plant is completely broken down into its components and then is put back together. Sometimes it's put back together with the original terpenes. Sometimes it's put back together with food-grade terpenes. I'm an old school gal. I like whole plants, I like joints, and I like cold water hash.
And yeah, sometimes when you hear in California houses blowing up, that's for those butane guys, just letting you guys know. Next question.
What kind of data, if any, do you have on consumption lounges and how the market affects consumption lounges?
So the question was about consumption patterns. Well, we still see, and I'll say this is true for everything. Everything pretty much has the same consumption pattern. The minority of consumers consume the majority of the product. It's true with alcohol. It's true with fast food. It's true with soda. Yes, you have your people that maybe have a soda a day, but soda drinkers drink a few cans per day. So it's the same with cannabis. You see that you have this very intense consumers that are consuming several times a day, and they're consuming most of the cannabis. Now, what's interesting is that I talked about those typologies, the primarily recreational versus primarily medical versus only. The primarily groups are using the most cannabis by far. The primarily recreational group is the highest consumer. So these are folks that say most of their use is recreational, but sometimes they do use medically. They are using the most cannabis of all four groups, followed by the primary medical, followed by the people that are only one or the other.
And we are starting to see more consumption lounges show up, because what's happening is you got all these states that are legalizing, but then the laws are saying you can't smoke in your apartment, you can't smoke in the park, you can't do this, so it defeats the purpose. So like in West Hollywood, I actually have a consumption lounge license that I got, but we tried to open, and then the health department stepped in because you're talking about edibles and things like that. So it's a lot of red tape that goes into it. New York's going to have the same problem, and hopefully they can get that part situated before they give those licenses out, or you'll be just like me. I've had that license for 2 years and have never given one edible away. Anybody else? Right here.
Hi, I got a two-part question. In regards to, we're on the precipice of sorry, excuse me. Right now we're on the precipice of getting this legislation off and running, regulations and whatnot, off and running in New York. What advice can you, it's just do we follow because each state has such different rules on their own. What is the best practice to follow?
So the question was about best practices to follow, given that states all have their own rules, right? I would say do not expect a state to regulate cannabis differently than they regulate everything else in the state. So when you're looking for low barriers to entry, look for states that have low barriers to entry to business, period. I don't think it's shocked to anybody that Oklahoma is basically come up to the counter, give me $500, and now you have a cannabis license, where California makes you jump through 500 hoops and pay $500 million in taxes before you can have a cannabis license. So I think that, when you're trying to figure out where to go or where to open, or kind of what's the lowest bar to entry, look at how that state regulates other things, because that's going to give you a really good clue into how high the taxes are going to be, how high the licensing fees are going to be, and what the compliance requirements are going to be to stay in business.
Cool. Thank you.
And that's me, and that's my email. I'll be walking around. It'll be easy to find me because I'll be hobbling, and you'll be able to catch me easily, so I can't run away from you. So I really invite you to find me, ask me deeper detailed questions, check out New Frontier Data. I told you it was going to be a 10,000-foot view in 40 minutes. Hopefully you got some nuggets of wisdom, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.